And I want to ask the next question. I would love to start off with you, Vinay, on why you think the world of foreign policy is inaccessible to young people. Feel free to directly contradict that statement as well, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good question and quite sort of frank and blunt one. I think there's good news and bad news here. And the bad news is I think foreign policy, and one could apply this almost to a lot of sectors in life, respects those in powers and those that have a strong interest. Those that have a platform are the ones that will have influence. And often, I think in the past you've found, and this applies to the young or youth, don't necessarily have that platform or that power at a young age. I think the good news is that things are rapidly changing. I think a couple of the other speakers hinted at this, but if you look at the way the modern state was conceived even over 100 years ago, it's changed so dramatically. I mean, just in the last 10 years, the way citizens interact and engage in the public realms completely transformed. Everybody might not be on Facebook, but Facebook is on everybody's mind, and how we deal with that and how we engage on that. And I think all types of networks, things around religion or political party or union were the way you were defined as a group, and the youth weren't a part of that. But now you have so many diffusive groups and networks are starting to break down. It's almost cliche to say that the power has been decentralized, but so much so that I think new groups, especially around the virtual digital space, and that's where I work today, in terms of managing and working on all of our social media properties at the State Department, we interact with so many groups, and we tell all of our leadership, and the Secretary embodies this and says that we need to take responsible risk, and we need to be at the sub-national level, if you will. Diplomacy and foreign affairs can't be nation to nation. There's a lot of, you have on this panel, nonprofit, private sector, and groups with just certain interests, and I think that's becoming individualized and personalized. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think you're starting to see a lot more engagement, not just with young, but with so many other types of groups, whether it's because I like black dogs or if I like brown cats. But if you have a strong group and you have strong leadership, individualized voices, they can have influence. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And we can talk about that as we go on. But I think the idea in the past of foreign policy not being accessible is one that we can shed. My own history in the State Department, when I joined the Foreign Service, I'd worked for the private sector for about 5 years, but I had a strong interest in foreign affairs only because I read the New York Times and other news almost religiously, and I took the Foreign Service exam. And that's a very direct way to get involved in foreign policy, to be in the civil service of the Foreign Service, but there's many other ways as well.
Absolutely, thank you so much, and I think we'll sort of delve a little bit more into this pathways for engagement into foreign policy. Elmira, you come at this sort of from a similar but slightly sort of different perspective as well, specifically looking at sort of the inaccessibility of foreign policy to women in the space, and I would love to hear sort of on a broader note why you think that is. Why is foreign policy inaccessible to so many key demographics?
I don't think foreign policy is inaccessible to whether it's women or key demographics. I think we're still using the old institutions and the old paradigms that we did in the 20th century. And what we had in the 20th century was traditionally white men in oak-paneled rooms at the State Department doing foreign policy. That's completely changed, and now you have different people doing foreign policy outside the State Department. You have entrepreneurs engaged in foreign policy. You have, as Monica pointed out, you have civil society organizations and NGOs and a lot of different people doing foreign policy in many different ways. And actually, the question that you posed to Vinay about, why is foreign policy inaccessible to young people? I actually think foreign policy is inaccessible to the State Department. And I think that the whole paradigm of foreign policy, we're living in a digital age, and you can even see the State Department grappling with trying to catch up with how foreign policy has changed. It's no longer taking place on a bilateral basis with ambassadors to ambassadors. It's people to people engaging in that. And I think what we need to do is we need to adjust the institutions and have that reflect the people who are engaged with it. And so when you're opening up the pages of the New York Times or you're turning on Charlie Rose, we can no longer just hear from the white men who used to do foreign policy. We need to hear from the women who are engaged in it, and we need to hear from the people on the front lines, whether they're in Pakistan or they're in Yemen or whether they're in Mexico, who are actually engaged in these day-to-day issues.
Yes, absolutely. Monica, you come at this sort of from an interesting take, and I think have a strong position on foreign policy and whether it's sort of carried out through governments or how those frameworks have changed. Sort of, I would love to bring you in here.
Sure. I wanted to highlight a little bit of an angle about foreign policy that doesn't get discussed much, especially among young people, and that's how public opinion affects the impact of organizations like the UN. And even organizations like the State Department. Policymaking on a government-to-government level might really be less accessible to people who don't work in that field, but those foreign policy decisions are not, as Elmira mentioned, they're not being made in isolation from the general public, and often they're reactionary to things that other players are doing. The State Department is considering what businesses and NGOs need when they make these policies, and in addition to that, a lot of those programs are directly funded by Congress. So the bottom line is that public opinion is affecting the impact of these programs on a huge level. You know, any issue that comes before our representatives in Congress has a force of people who are pushing their agenda and interest in its decision, whether it's education or a foreign policy program or transportation. And funding for the UN is approved by Congress. You know, it was, as I mentioned with the founding of the UN Foundation, it was less than 20 years ago that the U.S. was about to lose our seat at the UN because of the budget deficit. And even just 2 years ago, 177 members of Congress voted to withdraw from the UN completely. So these are members of Congress that the American public has elected, and oftentimes our foreign policy is significantly impacted by them. Another example, right now it's impossible for the Senate to ratify any treaties, even something as popular as the UN Treaty on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So our area of focus is really Congress's role in foreign policy, and it's an area that young people can have a really important impact in. I think my next slide, I just wanted to highlight that in the last 50 years we've had these incredible successes. You know, when you think back to the centuries or millennia of human history, the successes we've experienced in just the last 50, reducing global poverty, eradicating disease, would not have been possible without collaboration that organizations like the UN has facilitated, and frankly funding that countries like the US have appropriated. And still, if you could go to the next slide, Aman, the UN is getting attention from all corners of America in different directions. You know, we see the Missouri legislature banning the UN Agenda 21, which is really just a list of environmental sustainability ideas that came out of an environmental conference. The Texas Attorney General believes that the UN is going to come and take American guns or invade Texas. And so in order to find out what Americans thought, we decided to conduct a bipartisan poll, which revealed that 87% of Americans support an active role in the UN. But they're not speaking up, and that's really reflected in the way Congress is representing Americans. So if you could skip to, I think, 2 more slides. This is an example of how, unfortunately, political the conversation can be. So people often forget that as American citizens, you have a really important role to play in advocating to elected leaders. And we, you know, I work with a team of people who are on Capitol Hill every day, and it's getting harder and harder for them to make the case and move the needle just by using the facts. So we look to validators, people like grassroots advocates and businesses and NGOs, and frankly, advocates like members of the Roosevelt Institute in order to make our case.
Absolutely. Let me sort of ask Subrata as well. As a student in the space, currently sort of a very active one, how do you see this dynamic playing out?
I think if you just go to my slide, yeah. So I think we have to be really careful about how we participate in foreign policy. And I'm going to focus on social media narratives here because I think that's one way that youth participate in foreign policy, and it really influences what we think of foreign policy and how we think of conflicts occurring in other countries. And one thing that we really have to be aware of is that social media does not equate social movements. And
I want to bring up the Bring Back Our Girls campaign to highlight a couple of issues with social media, with narratives created by social media. The first of which is, when the campaign kind of first came out, there wasn't really a nuanced discussion on the complexity of the conflict itself. You heard these groups, you heard like Boko Haram, you heard these terms being thrown around, but there was no one really delved into a discussion. Well, how did this event really come about? What's the historical context around which this event occurred, or this incident occurred? And the second thing I really want to point out is the girl that's actually being used in this campaign photo. So these photos were actually taken by a photographer called Amy Vitali, and she wanted to take these photographs of village life in Guinea-Bissau, and she wanted to portray village life because she felt like the narrative on Africa is riddled by conflict. Like, we often understand Africa as a place where there's so much conflict, and she wanted to show a different side. Now, I think it's incredibly problematic that this photograph is being used as the face of an incident, of this horrific incident, and this is someone's daughter who's now the face of victimization, who's now the face of this incident that she has no relation to. And the fact that this photo was used without probably her permission points to issues of misrepresentation and appropriation, but also this is incredibly disempowering for the communities themselves. But it also colors our understanding of the conflict. That it limits our ability to have nuanced conversation when we're focusing more on the shock value rather than coming up with intellectual and thoroughly researched responses to these kinds of conflict. And that also hampers our ability to turn our ideas of foreign policy into action when we kind of rely on these narratives that really don't have a strong foundation or a strong basis. The second thing I'd want to point out is to understand our role within foreign policy. As a student, I understand that I'm not necessarily going to be the person to spearhead this movement, but I also realize, well, what is my capacity to create change? And change not necessarily in numerical results, but also more subtle ways of creating change, such as creating ideological shifts, or creating or even starting a certain conversation, like, let's say, a more nuanced understanding of a certain incident, or a nuanced understanding of our relations with other countries. So I think it's not so much that it's inaccessible, it's really how social media has influenced our ability to understand a lot of the occurrences that occur in our world is what we have to pay attention to.
Yes, absolutely, and I think you've sort of pointed out or hinted at one of the fundamental problems of the way I've sort of phrased that question, in terms of this is not necessarily a question of just of inaccessibility, and there are sort of multiple different roles and levels of agency that one can play here. Meredith, I want to ask you as well about what you think. Are there barriers to young people being involved in this type of policy? What do those look like? How have those framed your participation in the space?
Well, I would say one of the big barriers for engaging in foreign policy for young people, especially students, is it's hard to engage whenever you're stuck in the academic sphere. At least with my experience in higher education, I'm an international relations major. I learned, political theory. I wrote millions of essays on political theory, but I never once wrote anything resembling a foreign policy memo, or I never learned how to write to a nonprofit, or how to engage a stakeholder in foreign policy.